All right, let's talk about Magic Story's greatest arch nemesis, cancellations. This is a viewer request for me to talk about all of the history of sort of Magic publication cancellations. So first up is the Harper Prism novel line. This is sort of Magic's first story outsourced. Magic didn't really know what it wanted to be just then, and a lot of the stories felt like D&D with the serial numbers filed off, or literally the story of two decks dueling. This novel line lasted from 1994 to 1996. Almost none of it is relevant today, although some of the characters have gotten cards in recent years. Now, the reason for the cancellation of this line is twofold. First, in licensing deals like this, the terms are usually like 2 years. It's going to be the case, and especially when it comes to Magic comic books, they usually only last 2 years because generally that's how long the license is for. In addition to that, Magic wanted to start publishing story internally. So for the Mirage block, there was sort of an online web fiction element. And then as we got into the actual Weatherlight story, Wizards of the Coast was self-publishing the novels like they did for D&D novels. And that's where we got the Brothers' War, and that's where the term like revisionist history starts, because this is like basically resetting a lot of things that were established. This is the start of like a firmer canon for Magic. The old stuff still matters, but like there was a old antiquities comic that was essentially completely retconned out by this novel. Now on the comic book side, parallel to the Harper Prism novels were the Armada comics. Now, these are the actual foundational Magic stories. Some of them were retconned in novelized retellings. But for the most part, these are the stories that sort of created the foundational characters of Magic. And many of these characters would be brought back for Invasion or Time Spiral. Now, these novels only lasted like a year. They put out a lot of comics in that time. But in the mid-90s, the comic book industry crashed and Armada Comics was shuttered, so they didn't make any more after that. In 1998, alongside the newly self-published novel line, Dark Horse, who at the time was like the licensed comic publisher, they did a 4-part series called Gerard's Quest. My assumption is this didn't do very well because it was sort of, there was no follow-up whatsoever. The self-published novel line would continue for about a decade, until about the 2008 timeframe. Now, I should be clear, it wasn't continuing steadily for that whole decade. Interviews with some of the writers indicated that sales and thus pay and windows for writing were getting smaller and smaller, and so quality declined, and so people bought less of it. With Shards of Alara, we had sort of a soft reboot of the story, and a much tighter novel line where all 3 set stories were in one novel. Which genuinely, a lot of the older trilogies were just extremely padded and could have been one novel. And so we went from 3 to 6 books a year to 2 books, a Planeswalker novel that was about a particular character, and the main set story for whatever the current block was. This only lasted a couple years. The Curse of the Chain Veil, the Liliana-focused Planeswalker novel, was canceled. And after 2 books by Robert Wintermute, which is a pseudonym for a writer who's never actually been named, both of these were very low quality, obviously, written very quickly. The physical comic line was canceled. The story was kept going in Ravnica and Theros by some novellas by Doug Beyer and Jenna Helland. But eventually those were canceled too, leaving Innistrad with basically no story. Oh, sorry, I got that mixed up. So Innistrad basically had no story, and then they had the novellas for Ravnica and Theros. And then by Khans of Tarkir, the story had moved to web fiction online, which had sort of been, there were like side stories online for a few years, basically around this novella time frame, and that morphed into the web fiction being the main story. Now, in that same post-mending time frame, we had 2 different comic series. One was a web comic line published online by Wizards of the Coast. You can still find that pretty easily online. The other was an IDW series after that one was canceled. Now, the reasons the web comic line was canceled is just, It was expensive and time-consuming to make. IDW created a new character, Dak Faden, to be the star of their Magic the Gathering comic line, which basically told its own story. It didn't try and adapt a set story. Although Dak would end up being wherever the main story was at the time. This one lasted for about 2.5 years, until it was canceled sort of on a cliffhanger around Theros. Around the same time, the novella attempt also was canceled. I don't think we've got an exact reason why, but I assume it was declining sales. And again, roughly 2 years is usually like the licensing time frame, so a lot of the times you'll see the comic book publishers just don't renew it. And then around 2018, the franchise team came in to try and build up Magic as an IP. They had a novella from Brandon Sanderson, which my understanding is he basically wrote for free for them because he was way outside their budget. A lot of this was linked to War of the Spark, so Davriel Kane was a new random black-aligned planeswalker that Brandon then developed into an actual character. There are a lot of sort of rumors about what happened with this, with Wizards of the Coast trying to sell like a physical edition. I'm not going to get into that. Most of them are just that, rumors, which were sort of complicated because of all the other publishing mishaps during the time. So then there's War of the Spark Ravnica, which was the thing I was first hired at Wizards of the Coast to work on. This was the franchise team. It was a relatively new team. They needed someone who knew the characters. So there were sort of several problems with this novel, and this is separate from the issue with Forsaken. First is that this took the culmination of a web fiction story and put it behind a novel, which was, a lot of people called it a paywall. The second is that this was both a big culmination blockbuster event that, as the start of a new novel line, also had to be friendly to newcomers. And I think the final product really suffered as a result, trying to balance those two sort of opposing goals. There was also an issue with the web fiction story for Ravnica Allegiance and Guilds of Ravnica called The Gathering Storm by Django Wexler that got relegated to like a newsletter, an email newsletter. And then War of the Spark Forsaken rather infamously has a moment that implied that Chandra's interest in Nissa was a phase. There were a lot of complications at the time with Wizards of the Coast not fully committing to like queer content due to the markets they sell in. Like the novel line could do it, but web fiction couldn't. My understanding as someone who worked on this book is that that implication was accidental. Nissa and Chandra were meant to be broken up, but not necessarily like that. And it was in part a misunderstanding of Chandra's previous history with Gideon. This had a huge fallout, but the issues that arose here are the reason we now can have explicitly gay content in Magic Story. The web fiction is now geo-locked. And sensitivity readers are pretty standard now for Wizards to use on these kinds of stories. There was also a very brief IDW relaunch with a 4-issue Chandra comic, but it was so delayed between issues that after the 4th issue, they just never came out with their planned follow-up. There was also a novella line launched after the novels. Throne of Eldraine and Ikoria actually had pretty good novellas that I think a lot of people haven't read. But due to the fallout of Forsaken, they wanted to reevaluate like their processes. So the planned Theros Beyond Death story had been canceled. The Theros Beyond Death story and Curse of the Chain Veil are rather infamously stories that were canceled after being completed. And then finally, the most recent cancellation was the Boom comic. This was another example of the license just ran out. Again, about 2 years. Plus, the author behind it, Jed McKay, had to go on and write, like, Avengers and stuff now. This ended up being more of a history of Magic publications. If you want me to dive deeper into, like, what got things canceled, I can do that. Just let me know.